want to talk today about the ethnic dimension in foreign policy. Now, the inspiration for this topic came recently when I came across a book called Ambivalent Engagement: The United States and Regional Security in Southeast Asia After the Cold War. It was published last year by Joseph Lau, I believe, L-I-O-W, who's the dean of Rajaratnam School in Singapore, and he's an expert and authority generally on Asian Pacific affairs. And in this book, he talks about in one of the sections some of the complications of Chinese foreign policy and Chinese power projection in Southeast Asia. And he talks about, he coins the term, the ethnic Chinese dimension. Now, what he basically means by that is that in Southeast Asia, there's a, as you guys probably know, there's a large ethnic Chinese minority or diaspora throughout the Southeast Asian nations. And especially in countries where there are diverse populations, the ethnic Chinese population tends to be a source of controversy and resentment, especially because they generally tend to overperform academically and financially and so forth. And so he gives an example, like during the Asian financial crisis in Jakarta, there was an upsurge of anti-Chinese violence. You know, and so he talks about how this ethnic Chinese dimension is an important factor in how China views its relations in Southeast Asia. And he talks about it as a double-edged sword, double-edged because on the one hand, it gives China entry into Southeast Asia and a certain commonality and common language. But on the other hand, he says that it's a complicating factor because basically it becomes difficult for China to exercise restraint in Southeast Asia during periods where ethnic Chinese communities become subject to discrimination or whatnot. So Lau gives an example that I found very interesting. It was in 2016, and Malaysia, like a lot of multi-ethnic societies, is struggling with this issue of affirmative action and distributive outcomes. I mean, what do you do when certain segments of the population have more than others, and then how do you balance that with concerns about equality? How do you make a multi-ethnic democracy work? So anyway, in 2016, there was a very contentious, high-profile national debate happening in Malaysia over affirmative action. And basically, the country was seeking to adopt affirmative action policies in favor of the ethnic Malay community, which appeared to be coming at the expense of China's, or the large ethnic Chinese community in Malaysia. And so the Chinese ambassador went to Chinatown during the heart of this debate in Malaysia and basically made some comments that in defense of the ethnic Chinese community, but in practice ended up inflaming the situation. And they provoked outcries and accusations of Chinese interference in Malaysia's domestic affairs. So Lau here is basically talking about how this ethnic factor will become a factor as China projects power not only in Southeast Asia, but elsewhere. Now, I mean, obviously, China is not unique in thinking about this ethnic factor in its foreign relations. It's in many ways the norm in virtually every country's foreign policy. I mean, you see it in Russia, where much of their intervention in the Balkans is informed by their alliances or sympathy with ethnic Russians, Serbs, and whatnot. You see it in Iranian foreign policy, where they tend to act on behalf of their co-religionists and Persians sort of throughout the Gulf. But obviously, this ethnic question has particular salience when you're talking about countries that seek or aspire to global leadership, where they big part of their success as a global power has to do with how they appeal, how they project power and influence, and ultimately the degree to which their power and authority and influence is regarded as being legitimate. So this section of the book made me think about, well, how does the ethnic factor, ethnic dimension, as Lau coins it, how does it pertain to American foreign policy? And what does it mean about our prospects as a global leader, and also in this competition between American and Chinese power? So three thoughts came to mind on how the ethnic dimension pertains to American foreign policy. I think one has to do with our identity as an immigrant nation. And so what that means in practice is that when we have diasporas in this country that retain ties and sympathies, cultural, economic, historical, whatever, to certain countries around the world, they tend to form lobbies and exert an outsized influence over American foreign policy. Now, I think there's obviously a debate here on whether or not that's a positive or a negative thing, but if you look at American intervention, for example, in the Balkans, you can see it actually in World War I, where the Italian-American community played an active role in mobilizing the country. You also see it actually in our foreign policy elite, where the fact that we have a diverse immigrant cohort, our diplomatic corps, and so forth, tends to be an entryway into certain cultures. So I think during the Obama administration, for example, the U.S. ambassador to India was an Indian American. So that's one factor. I think the other is the fact that America's identity, in part due to ethnic relations, is tied to Western civilization generally, and especially the Anglosphere. And that causes or allows or facilitates ties between the U.S. and other great successful powers around the world, whether it's the U.K. or Canada or Australia, or increasingly even countries that emerged from British colonialism that have adopted some of these practices. I think ethnicity, for example, and this legacy has to do in part with why U.S.-India relations are developing, or U.S. relations with the Philippines and other places. And then the final thing I would call sort of the ethnic factor, which is to say that America's identity as a universalist country, a country that believes at some level that our ideals should transcend ethnicity. And so this is why, for example, when human rights atrocities happen around the world, or when we're trying to defend our foreign policy or our actions, we often resort to language about freedom or democracy, or general kind of ideas, and even if in practice they're informed by various considerations about our strategic or vital interests, or about economic interests, or about domestic drivers, whatever it is, that we resort to this universalist language, and we do so, I would argue, not entirely cynically. I think this is part of our identity. Now, my thought here is that this issue of the ethnic dimension, I think, is a relatively underrated factor in thinking about, on the one hand, whether China can become a genuine global power, a genuine stakeholder, a genuine global hegemon, and whether or not the U.S. can continue to play that role. Now, I mean, I think if you followed some of my writing over the last couple of years, I'm somewhat pessimistic about American trend lines when it comes to our deficits, our entitlement culture, many of the social pathologies that are eating away at our identity and so forth. But even if I'm somewhat negative or pessimistic about American trend lines, I am broadly optimistic about America's ability to lead, about our ability to continue to maintain this global leadership or hegemon role. And I think a big part of it is the fact that we're at an enormous advantage when it comes to these soft power considerations, I think it's going to be very hard for China, whatever its economic growth, whatever its raw military power, that if their foreign policy and their identity as a nation is being informed by these ethnic considerations, and if they're finding that in key regions that are not able to exercise their power or project power in a responsible way without consideration of these ethnic issues, that's going to be a real liability and disadvantage, I think, compared to a country like the U.S., which is much more comfortable with making appeals to universalism, which is able to lay down rules and order and law, and is able to create a language that, at least in theory, all people can aspire to. Now, I think this Trump phenomenon will be an interesting test case here, because I think Trump, but as an individual, but more generally the movement that really is that he has galvanized, are really flirting with this idea of whether or not America actually is a universalist nation, or whether it should be gravitating more toward becoming something like or more of an ethno-state, where we really do internalize this identity as being a white Christian Anglosphere sort of a nation. And you saw that in that bizarre episode recently on where Tucker Carlson, I believe it was Tucker Carlson, ran a segment on the plight of South Africa's white farmers, and then Trump got animated about that and engaged on it. I think the more that we veer in that direction toward being an ethno-state that really has a self-conscious identity of being less universalistic and more identity-based, I think there are going to be problems associated with that. I think it's going to lower our appeal and our ability to lead around the world and lay down a certain international order that people ultimately can resonate with and buy into.